where apophexes do deny, reflections of a xanthous sky, and black stars reign without a scent. Echoes of what was never meant. A city built in unknown times, upon the bones of countless crimes. Stranger yet is found within the chaos court of strife and sin. The mad dance here without control, as all must play their given role. For those beyond our moral ken, we die and live and die again. Our Lord, he writhes atop his throne. Before his glory we atone. Our blood a gift, fit for a king, for a noose round our neck, a puppet's string. Today, dear viewers, we invite you to attend a tale of a strange place, receiving a visitor every bit as peculiar. But what is this place, and who is this visitor? In the Tower of London, in a secret room that once held prisoners of the crown, there is a hidden doorway. This doorway, believed to be built by the 19th century alchemist Henry Percy, leads to a strange place, a city that corresponds to no known location, earthly or otherwise. It resembles the streets of ancient Rome, not how they actually looked, but how they would appear in a dream, with no sense or logic. The colors in this place are muted, with only yellow, black, white, and red being visible. The ocean surrounding this place is an inky void, the sky above a pale golden hue dotted with black stars that look like no constellation ever recorded. This strange place outside of time is the city of Alagadda, a city that has inspired countless occultists and artists, and driven just as many to madness. The surreal and sinister locale is the source of many infamous SCPs, including SCP-035, a malevolent theatrical mask that takes over the body of whoever wears it. There's also SCP-701, the Hanged King's Tragedy, an anomalous play that compels the people performing it to enact brutal ritual sacrifices live on stage. All the while their audience enters a state of mad and violent reverie, often resulting in tens or sometimes even hundreds of brutal deaths on opening night. When the SCP Foundation first sent a party through the secret door, all of the members of the group suddenly found their clothes and belongings had disappeared. Instead, they were dressed in elaborate costumes like the ones worn at Venetian Carnival, complete with masks. The costumes could be removed, but the masks, which seemed to be made of a living material similar to beetle shells, had fused to their faces and couldn't be removed. Once in Alagata, the agents felt immense psychological effects, what can best be described as a hypnogenic malaise. Everything felt like a dream, and only those agents who had previous experience with lucid dreaming were able to maintain full self-control and retain memories of their journey. As for the others, they seemed to lose control of themselves immediately and fell prey to the many decadent vices the city had to offer. The group rounded a corner, which they initially thought went left, but in fact led them directly up. Before they could take the time to comprehend the impossible dimensions, a figure emerged from a dark alley, dressed in fine red velvet decorated with golden diamonds. On his face was a red and gold mask in the style of the Arlecchino character from traditional Commedia dell'arte. In his hands was a bottle containing a pearlescent white liquid. Through a door down the alley, the explorers could hear the sounds of rowdy laughter and pounding music.
A visit to Alagadda isn't complete without a visit to the Parlor of Memories.
The figure beckoned.
We have memories of all kinds, happy, tragic, poignant, even romantic.
The first sample's free. The vendor uncorked the bottle and let the smell of indescribable longing waft over the group. It was impossible to resist for most of them. Much like it is impossible to resist our excellent videos, and if you never want to miss one, your best bet is to subscribe now and never miss another.
Other similar vendors around the cities piled them with hopes, fears, and even dreams, which were served in glasses like expensive wine. Some of the team members were directly led off by the hands of giggling, extravagantly dressed women, their faces obscured by delicate Colombiana masks. Soon enough, the only explorer on the team who was left was Dr. Calixto Narvaez, who had been chosen for the mission specifically because of his past experience with altered mental states. He was an experienced lucid dreamer and an avowed psychonaut, who was used to maintaining his presence of mind while in states beyond the limits of regular perception. Because of that, he resisted the temptations of the city and was able to take notes with perfect clarity while he explored the impossible dimensions of the main plaza. Most of the beings that he encountered were humanoid, wearing similar masks and costumes, but one creature stood out as being a fellow outsider to this world. It was a bird-like entity similar to an ibis, carrying an ornate scroll. This creature introduced himself as the Wandsman of Kulmanas, part of an ancient order of researchers tasked with reporting on important events throughout the multiverse. Curious to know more, and excited to meet a fellow scholar, Dr. Narvaez started to ask the Wandsman more questions about the strange city and how he had come to learn so much about it. The following story is his tale of how he first came to know the city of Alagadda and what he learned in his travels. The Wandsman had been trying to put together a publication on Alagadda for some time, knowing that it was home to many political intrigues and scandals that ought to be recorded for readers of the Wandsman's Gazette. But due to Alagadda's dreamlike mind-altering qualities, it was incredibly difficult to get the full picture of. Previous Wandsmen before this one had returned to the editors empty-handed, with no recollection of what had happened to them on their journeys, and often their memories of their earlier life scraped out of their deepest mind. Other Wandsmen had simply never returned at all. The Wandsman of Kulmanas was, like Dr. Narvaez, selected for the assignment because of his skill when it came to lucid dreaming and altered states. He came from a shamanic tradition in his home dimension, and one of his other epithets was the Walker of the Astral Plane. So he was the perfect candidate to finally write an in-depth travelogue and political profile on the mysterious realm of Alagadda. He found his way to the city through the Wanderer's Library. This is a sacred, holy place for many groups and peoples, perhaps most infamously, the Serpent's Hand. It is the repository for all knowledge that has existed, does exist, and will come to exist. And through portals known as the Ways, it can also allow free passage to anywhere else in the vast and complex multiverse. This was the service that many Wandsmen, when not researching for flavor text in their articles, had employed the Wanderer's Library for. And given that a bird-like humanoid entity would likely cause a stir walking past tourists in the Tower of London, the Wanderer's Library would be the safest way for him to reach Alagadda. Like the SCP agents, once he arrived, he found himself suddenly dressed in carnival robes and an organic mask that he couldn't remove. He took his leave from the Alagadda Library, the so-called Athenaeum of Severed Tongues, and began to explore. Alagadda was not as dark and dismal as he'd experienced before embarking on his journey. Instead, he found that the city was a place of glamour and revelry. The residents believing they were in a non-stop carnival. The air around them was filled with the sweet smells of flowers and old books. The Wandsman soon found that the distances within the city were highly mutable, and it took him a fraction of the time he expected it would take to reach the Hall of Mercurial Virtue. This was the center of the Hanged King's Court, where beings from all over the multiverse gathered to engage in debauched acts too salacious to report in this account. Among the crowd, the Wandsman saw a centurial dreamsmith, a Vestal of Deva, and the deathless merchant of London. In this court of gods and monsters, the Wandsman witnessed the sacrifice of a hatchling with a ceremonial knife. This was a ritual designed to feed the cultivores, creatures who fed not on the flesh, but on the symbolism and meaning behind this gruesome act. When this happened, the Wandsman felt the need to avert his eyes, and that's when he saw them, 3 of the 4 masked lords of Alagadda. There was the White Lord, who wore the mask of diligence, the Red Lord, who wore the mask of mirth, and the Yellow Lord, who wore the mask of odiousness. Unaccounted for was the Black Lord, wearer of the mask of anguish. Upon further research, the Wandsman heard rumors that the Black Lord, due to some political scandal, had been exiled to some forgotten backwater dimension. A shiver went down the Wandsman's spine as he regarded their hard porcelain visages. Suddenly, the crowd parted, and a new figure entered the room flanked by an entourage of harlequin sycophants and paper guards. Unlike everyone else the Wandsman had met in Alagadda, this mysterious new figure didn't wear a mask, making them stand out amongst the crowd. The crowd chattered excitedly, and some tried to get closer, only to be shoved aside by members of the entourage. "Stand aside!" one of the harlequin masked figures called out. "Make way for the ambassador of Alagadda!" The Wandsman recognized that name, as anyone with a passing familiarity with Alagadda would, but in reality, that title felt like it was somewhat lacking. The ambassador was more than a mere dignitary. They were the very voice of the hanged king. Even the masked lords bowed their heads in reverence. It seemed like the ambassador was the guest of honor at this revel. And now that they were here, who knew what new levels of wickedness would unfold? It was at this point that the Wandsman knew he had to leave, but that was easier said than done. The gods were drunk and the laws of physics no longer applied. As he tried to get further away from the revel, he found himself deeper and deeper in a twisted labyrinth without rhyme or reason. In the maze, he saw nobody aside from other versions of himself, dressed in the colors of Alagadda: red, black, white, and yellow. A terror came over the Wandsman. How long had he been here? How many versions of himself had come and gone through this maze and become trapped? He opened doors that led nowhere, went up stairs that actually led down, and turned down corners that never seemed to end. Eventually, he found himself back in the Hall of Mercurial Virtue, but something wasn't right. Gone were the throngs of revelers, the smells of lust and sweet meats, the cacophonous noise. Instead, the room was devoid of life and cold as if nobody had been here in decades. The only living things were the red climbing vines that had crept up the walls in the indeterminate time he'd been away. He searched the room for any clues of what might have happened. In the center of the floor, the Wandsman found a hole. Or not a hole, he realized. It was more like a gaping wound. An amber liquid oozed out of the hole like a foul-smelling tree sap. Since none of the doors in the hall led to the outside, the Wandsman saw no other possible exit from this nightmarish place. Steeling himself, he crawled into the hole, deep into the underground heart of the city. In his own world, he'd performed shamanic rituals that had also felt like they were stretching on for days, dragging him through unknown horrors. The Wandsman knew that the only way to get through it was to ride it all the way through to the end. He didn't know what exactly was the force that kept him going, whether it was his own will or some outside force controlling him like a puppet on a string. Either way, he pushed forward. He was a scholar and an explorer. He needed to find out as much as he could about how this blighted place worked, even though he could barely even tell what was real and what might have also been in his head. He had no memory of finding his way out of the underground tunnel. It was simply that in one moment he was there, and in the next moment he was in a crumbling stone room. Much like the Hall of Mercurial Virtue, it was devoid of life and overgrown with strange plants as if long abandoned. The scents of flowers and books had become cloying, as though the city was wilting and falling apart. Cautiously, the Wandsman descended the spiral staircase that led out of the room into the unknown once more. The staircase felt as if it stretched on forever, and the further down the Wandsman climbed, the more he became aware of a whispering voice speaking in a language he'd never heard before. This was strange, because to this point, everywhere he'd been in Alagadda, there had seemed to be a universal translation effect, where no matter what language was being spoken, the people around them could understand it. The Wandsman was apprehensive. To him, this seemed like a sign that he was leaving the bounds of the known world and entering a space of pure chaos. The longer he walked, the more the Wandsman felt his very sense of self dissolving. Had he ever been anywhere else but this stairway? He found that he could barely remember. He felt like a stray thought in the head of a greater intelligence. A poem repeated itself in the Wandsman's head, as if someone else had put it there.
Embers and burning feathers, drifting through the firmament, carried by wind, as if my wings were not vestigial. To land I am anchored. By murderous gravity, I am reformed, only to be torn apart again, again, and again. Every trace, recycled reminders of who I used to be. I became blood on the hands of criminals. I became the noose around my own throat. From death I am become one step closer to real.
After this nightmarish ordeal, he was brought back to whatever could be called reality by a scream, though initially he didn't know if it was his own or someone else's. It didn't seem like his own voice, but there was nobody else in the darkness who could have made the noise, or so he thought. A form emerged in the darkness as if materializing out of the Wandsman's thoughts. It was a great throne, and as more of the scene materialized, the Wandsman made out the shapes of hanging tapestries, shackles, mounted swords, and finally sitting upon the throne, the hanged king himself. He was shackled to the wall, his face covered by a veil and his neck ringed with thorns. Hooks, spears, and daggers stuck out from his body, and he seemed to writhe in pain. That's when the Wandsman realized the scream must have come from the hanged king himself. Also standing in this combined throne room and dungeon was the ambassador of Alagata, much smaller than the hanged king, but carrying themselves with the same regal countenance. The Wandsman couldn't see the ambassador's face, but he could sense a cold, almost sadistic curiosity in the way the figure slightly tilted their head toward the hanged king. The hanged king lunged towards the ambassador, but the chains kept them apart. The ambassador, unmoved by this outburst, reached out to lift the veil over the hanged king's face. Underneath it was a void, a complete lack of utter matter or substance. The Wandsman couldn't look away. He felt drawn in by the sheer emptiness, and the more he looked, the more it encompassed his entire vision. At this point, the Wandsman lost his memory completely. When he roused again, he was back in a familiar place, the Wanderer's Library. After an eternity in the Hanged King's dungeon, the Wandsman of Cool Manas struggled to readjust to the much more mundane, familiar surroundings. The walls around him stretched as far as he could see, covered in books from every time and every place in the multiverse. Their spines were a rainbow of colors, from red to green to blue to black, which felt strange to behold after being surrounded by the ever-present reds and golds of Alagadda. The Wandsman reached up to his face and found the mask finally gone, only able to feel his feathers and beak where the hard shell had been just a moment ago. His experiences in the city of Alagadda were as if only a dream, but the Wandsman knew in his heart that everything he'd seen was real. Quickly, he grabbed a scroll and a pot of ink and started to write down everything he could remember, determined to finish his otherworldly travelogue. Since that initial exploration and the success of the story once it was published, the Wandsman of Cool Manas became the Wandsman Gazette's go-to correspondent for Alagadda. As he explained to Dr. Neveres, he had been back an additional 3 times since that first visit. In that time, he'd become intimately acquainted with the politics of the city. He led Dr. Neveres to the city's library, the door which he used to pass back and forth, and before the 2 explorers parted ways, the Wandsman left the doctor with a grave warning.
The ambassador of Alagadda has returned. I take my leave of this place,
and I suggest you do the same. Based on the chilling story he'd told of being lost in the dungeon of the Hanged King, Dr. Neveres thought it best to take the Wandsman at his word. Now check out SCP-2264 in the Court of Alagata and What If SCP-096 War SCP-035 for more.